There is one issue with which America has always struggled, one that runs through and affects all aspects of American society and shapes the politics, ideology, and culture of the country to such a degree that it has in many ways come to define the nation itself. That issue is crime. From the outlaws of the Wild West to serial killers, from prohibition-era gangsters to white-collar financial criminals, from cult and militia leaders to mass shooters and domestic terrorists, the history of crime and criminals is the history of America. It is within the subject of crime that we see the socioeconomic and ideological issues that shape America play out in real terms. The battles between social classes, the realities of economic and racial inequality, the question of freedom, even the promise of the American dream itself are all contained within a discussion of criminal justice. By examining this subject, we can come to understand the deeper currents of American identity. Crime and policing are, of course, global concerns that exist within every country. But in America, a country with more people incarcerated than any other, they carry a deeper meaning. How to punish criminals, the power and reach of the police, what lies behind the peaks and valleys of the crime rate are topics that continue to be studied and debated. And it is crime, more than any other issue, that is weaponized to control the public, create fear or outrage to sway the masses from support or opposition to a party or a person.
Crime is an American epidemic.
I believe crime is like any other epidemic. The best time to stop it is before it starts.
This epidemic of violence destroys lives, destroys communities, and destroys opportunity for young Americans.
When examining America's justice system, there is no single cause and no single person at the center of the debate. However, for much of the 20th century, one man can be seen to embody many of the ideals and controversies surrounding the police, spending 14 years at the center of the storm, holding the line, protecting what he saw as the good people from what he believed were the bad. Depending on your politics, Daryl Gates is either admired for his innovations in law enforcement and his fierce loyalty to his officers, or he is despised for these same reasons. He is either a strong, straight-talking, they don't make him like this anymore kind of a man, or he is a racist bully who helped usher in an era of police militarization. But for better or worse, Daryl Gates left an indelible impact on America in the 20th century, shaping its policies and its culture through his involvement with an institution that would be his home for 43 years. The Los Angeles Police Department.
Personnel is the key to maintaining the high standard of police protection established in Los Angeles. The right combination of mental and physical proficiency, psychological maturity, and professional integrity is found in every 25th man.
The 1930s and 40s were a tumultuous time for the city of Los Angeles. Mayor Frank Shaw, elected in 1933, is responsible for having led the most corrupt administration in Los Angeles history. Shaw hired his brother Joe and gave him the title of private secretary, then gave him de facto control over the city's police and fire departments. He eventually became known as the administration's chief fixer, using the LAPD as spies, enforcers, and collectors.
Soon the rumors of corruption began to spread, and when they became too much, investigations were launched. They found more than 1,000 instances of gambling and prostitution rackets allegedly operating under the protection of the mayor's office. Everything came to a head in 1938 when Harry Raymond, a private investigator and former officer who was investigating the corruption, was the victim of a car bomb. Despite suffering over 150 shrapnel wounds, Raymond survived and presented his evidence to the grand jury. Police Captain Earl Kinnett was arrested and convicted of bombing Raymond's car, while rumors swirled that he took his directions from someone in City Hall. The bombing ended up being the last straw, and although he was never charged with a crime, Shaw was ousted from office in 1938. Still the only Los Angeles mayor to ever be recalled, and the first mayor in America to be thrown out of office. This being Hollywood, the whole sordid incident was used as inspiration for the 1939 film The Man Who Dared. And this being Hollywood, Shaw sued Warner Brothers for $1 million, alleging defamation. They settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. In 1948, the department was again rocked with scandal when an investigation revealed that Brenda Allen, a well-known madam with mafia connections, was receiving police protection and paying off members of LAPD's Gangster Squad, a task force assigned to specifically combat organized crime. The ensuing trial brought down the chief of police, Clements Horrell, and the assistant chief, Joe Reed, both of whom were forced to resign. The LAPD was yet again embroiled in controversy, and once again the department was an embarrassment. Reform was desperately needed. This was the Los Angeles Police Department, mired in scandal and seen by the public as untrustworthy and corrupt, which William H. Parker III would join in 1927. Parker's first interest was law, and he studied while with the department, passing the bar in 1930, but choosing to continue to work as a police officer. In the 1930s, he worked to amend the city charter, extending the rights of officers so they were answerable only to a board of rights composed of other officers. He also extended the rights of the chief of police, making it nearly impossible to be ousted from the position and ostensibly making it a lifetime appointment. These changes effectively put the police force outside the control of the police commission and any kind of elected official. In fact, this alone is enough to solidify Parker's place in LAPD history, as the repercussions would be felt throughout the 20th century. He briefly left the department in 1943 to serve in the armed forces, where he would receive several accommodations before returning to the LAPD in 1945. It was in 1950 that he was promoted to chief of police, replacing Clements Horrell after he was forced to retire. When Parker took office, he said he would, with all the fiber of his being, see to it that the crooked rats who would change the City of Angels to the City of Diablos will not do so, and that the LAPD would work for the community, not rule it. Parker's plan was to clean the department, transform its image, and expand its power. He changed the performance standards, introduced police science as a tool of law enforcement, and revamped the police recruitment and training procedures. On the whole, he restructured the operation of the LAPD around a military model. He also understood the importance of public perception and established a positive working relationship with Hollywood. When NBC greenlit Dragnet, the first police procedural for production, Parker offered unlimited help and resources, so long as his people were allowed to vet the scripts.
Fatima Cigarettes, best of all king-size cigarettes, brings you Dragnet, the authentic story of your police force in action.
Parker ensured the officers were depicted as calm, cool, ethical, and professional.
All at once, you lost your first name. You're a cop, a flatfoot, a bull, a dick, John Law. You're the fuzz, the heat, you're poison, you're trouble, you're bad news. They call you everything, but never a policeman.
He made one of his officers script consultant and also appointed him as his chief speechwriter, a young man named Gene Roddenberry, who resigned in 1957 to write for television full-time, supposedly basing the cold, unfeeling Spock on Parker.
Fascinating.
According to Joe Domanick in his excellent book To Protect and Serve, the LAPD's Century of War in the City of Dreams, Parker believed in the predatory nature of man and saw America as the most lawless nation on Earth that had only the thin blue line, a phrase he popularized, of the police force to maintain order. Parker wanted officers who would practice proactive policing, which meant give no slack and take no shit from anyone. Confront and command, control the streets at all times, always be aggressive, stop crimes before they happen, seek them out, shake them down, make that arrest, and never admit the department had done anything wrong. It was Parker that established the unwritten credo, if you beat the shit out of someone, we'll back you 100%, but if you take even 1 penny, your ass is ours. This led to a department that was, at least outwardly, free of corruption, professional, orderly, and the premier police force in the country. But of course, that's not how many of the residents of Los Angeles saw it. In 1960, William Parker testified to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights that the Negro in Los Angeles committed 11 times as many crimes as other races. As far as Mexicans went, some of those people are not too far removed from the wild tribes of the district of the inner mountains of Mexico. I don't think you can throw genes out of the equation when you discuss behavior patterns of people. Parker refused to apologize for these remarks and was virtually untouchable thanks to his extensive PR machine, his charter-enforced lifetime tenure, and his alleged practice of using his extensive network of wiretaps as blackmail. While today many police departments depict Parker as a broad-minded leader and hang photos of him posing with young black recruits, the reality is that he oversaw a segregated department whose officers used intimidation tactics, racial profiling, and violence. He shrugged off complaints as boys will be boys and refused to acknowledge that police brutality existed in his force. The LA City Council, for the most part, supported him and ignored the violence being seen in minority communities. They bought into his thin blue line rhetoric, which characterized the police as the only defense against society devolving into chaos. The 1940s and 50s saw a massive influx of black residents into Los Angeles, escaping the Jim Crow laws of the South, and Mexican people escaping the horrible conditions of the Great Depression. By the late 1950s, the face of Los Angeles had changed, and Parker was seeing criticism for his attitudes and methods. His proactive method of policing minority neighborhoods amounted to constantly hassling a population it clearly despised.
They came in and flooded a community that wasn't prepared to meet them, despite the fact that we got all this relief money going in there. We didn't ask these people to come here. And suddenly they want a total community to adjust itself to a small segment that has suddenly come taking over a section.
Anything could get someone a ticket, and if they couldn't pay that ticket, there would be a warrant, and the next time they were stopped, it would be an arrest. Complaints about police abuse of power were seen almost daily in the black press of LA. In 1957, the Los Angeles chapter of the NAACP demanded that Parker be fired. In 1958, the ACLU claimed the LAPD was lawless and presented statistics that only 2 of the 80 charges of police violence brought by their clients resulted in investigations, and of the 21 charges of civil rights violations, none were investigated. Parker himself was feeling the pressure. His health was failing. He was smoking 2 packs a day and increasingly relying on alcohol, earning the nickname Whiskey Bill behind his back. He stumbled, slurred his words, and at times had to be carried home. A new candidate for mayor, Sam Yorty, campaigned in part by calling for the integration and reform of the police department and to stop the abuse of minority communities. He denounced Parker's Gestapo-like tactics and claimed that Parker should enforce the law and stop making remarks about minority groups who were not living in the South. He was elected in 1961. Once elected, however, Yorty left Parker alone for the most part. According to one city councilman, Parker entered the mayor's office with a briefcase. When he came out of that 2-hour meeting, they have been sweethearts ever since. I'd like to get that file Parker has on him and make that public. Parker dismissed the allegations as baseless. All rumors aside, the fact was that with minority populations growing and rising racial tensions largely being ignored by Parker, the situation was bound to boil over. And in 1965, on a sweltering August night, it finally did, in the neighborhood of Watts. On August 11, 1965, Officer Lee Minkus was on patrol when he pulled over a car for speeding and suspicion of drunk driving. The driver, Marquette Fry, was drunk, as was his brother Ronald in the passenger seat. But Marquette was a happy drunk, and at first, he was very cooperative, clowning with the officer and putting on a show for the crowd that was beginning to gather. It was when Marquette's mother, Rena, arrived and began to lay into him for being drunk that things took a turn. Marquette, probably embarrassed at having his mother yell at him in front of a growing crowd, began to bristle. He turned on Minkus and began yelling and refused to be handcuffed. The crowd had grown steadily and by now numbered around 400 as backup, called earlier by Minkus's partner, started to arrive on the scene. As patrol cars and motorcycles streamed onto the scene, the crowd turned menacing at the overt show of force. Marquette tried to slip into the crowd and disappear. As he did, an officer smashed his head with a baton. Minkus grabbed Marquette and tried to force him into the patrol car when his brother Ronald punched Minkus in the gut and his mother Rena leapt on his back. She was pulled off and roughly pinned against the hood of a car. The sight of 5-foot Rena Fry grappling with the police while her son Marquette was beaten enraged the crowd that was continuing to grow in size. One officer claimed that a woman, Joyce Ann Gaines, spat at him. He dragged her out of the crowd and put her in a stranglehold. Gaines worked in a barber shop down the street, and her blue smock could easily have been mistaken for a maternity dress. A rumor spread through the crowd that the police were beating a pregnant woman. The anger, the violence, the brutality escalated. More reinforcements arrived, in all over 26 patrol cars and motorcycles. As the police retreated with Marquette, they were showered with bottles and rocks, and after they had gone, the crowd threw them at passing white motorists. In all, the confrontation lasted more than 5 hours, involved 1,000 residents and dozens of police officers, and it began an uprising, which would last for 6 days. Later, Parker would describe the riot beginning when one person threw a rock, and then like monkeys in a zoo, others started throwing rocks. The department, despite the money it had spent on utilizing the best technology and organizing itself into an orderly, disciplined group run with military efficiency, was caught off guard. Parker, now 63 and suffering from a heart aneurysm, was unable to take charge. In the years following Watts, riots would break out nationwide, over 150 in 1967 alone. But at that time, no one had seen anything of this magnitude, and no one knew how to deal with it. There was massive communication breakdown among the force. Each division operated on its own unique radio frequency instead of one system for the entire city. This made it impossible to properly coordinate efforts. There was no one leading and no coordinating strategy as to how to deal with such an overwhelming number of people. Somewhere around 30,000 of the area's 500,000 residents were involved. In the beginning, the police tried to get people back in their homes, but all they could be in the face of such crowds and such anger was an intimidating presence. Looting was rampant. Police cars were pelted with bottles and rocks. Men, women, and children were beaten in the streets by police. As the fire spread through Watts, local radio DJ Magnificent Montague's signature catchphrase, "Burn, baby, burn,"
Burn my heart with desire.
became the anthem of the rebellion. On the third day, the National Guard arrived. A curfew was called. Tanks were assigned to protect the USC campus. There were reports of sniper fire. The National Guard went block by block to halt the rebellion. In all, it took more than 14,000 guardsmen and officers to quell the uprising. Parker described the situation as very much like fighting the Viet Cong. On August 17th, the curfew was lifted. In all, there were over 4,000 arrests, over 1,000 wounded, and 34 dead. Martin Luther King visited the scene and described an encounter he had there. One young man said to me, "We won, we won." I said, "What do you mean we won? 30-some people are dead and all but 2 are Negroes. You've destroyed your own. What do you mean we won?" And he said, "We made them pay attention to us." King would later write that there was joy among the rioters because they had asserted themselves against a system which was quietly crushing them into oblivion, and now they were somebody. In the aftermath of the riots, Parker fought against every recommendation for change and virulently defended his department. According to Parker, if anything, the riots were evidence of how much LA needed the police, needed him. He returned to work in 1966, as popular as ever, perhaps more so. He died of a heart attack a year later while attending a banquet in his honor. Later that year, police headquarters would be renamed Parker Center. Daryl Francis Gates was born in Glendale, California in the summer of 1926. Growing up, his father was an alcoholic who had repeated run-ins with the police until finally going cold turkey in 1935. In 1942, Gates was briefly brought into juvenile detention after assaulting an officer over a traffic ticket, but was released when he agreed to apologize. After high school, he signed up for the Navy and served 2 years in the Pacific. He attended the University of Southern California thanks to the GI Bill, but from there was lost as to what to do next. He settled on law school, but plans changed again when he met his wife and soon found himself a husband, a soon-to-be father, and in desperate need of money. When a friend told him about the police academy's 3-week training course and promise of a $290 a month salary, he decided he could enroll, pay off his debts, and finish college through night school. By September 1949, Daryl Gates was a member of the LAPD, serving as a traffic cop, but still intending to go to night school. That was when he was given a job as William Parker's driver. Gates's 15 months driving Parker became, in his own words, a tutorial for how to be chief. Parker became a father figure for Gates. By day, he studied Parker's actions and demeanor, absorbed his brilliance, as he said, and at night he drove a drunken Parker home and carried him to his door. He was a great admirer of Parker the man, but also of Parker's methods, his proactive policing. He praised Parker for making the LAPD the most aggressive police department in the country, for making the officers proud to be officers. After his time with Parker, Gates moved on to the juvenile division, then to Vice. Gates was talented, a hard worker, and well-liked among the other officers. He moved up the ranks, getting promoted to sergeant, then lieutenant in 1959, a promotion which would put him back working with Parker, this time as his adjunct, one of his right-hand men. By the time of the Watts riots in 1965, he was an inspector. Gates was a field commander during the riots and had given a controversial order to pull back after the police had finally contained everyone in houses. When the people saw the police retreating, the rioting began again in earnest. Gates himself was following orders from Roger Murdoch, the deputy chief. While in his memoir, Gates would write that, "I felt pretty shitty about this, thinking it was an unwise decision. A report from the Times shows he agreed with Murdoch and thought they lacked the manpower to be effective and that the disorder would quiet down on its own." In his memoir, Gates writes about feeling overwhelmed during the riots. "We did not know how to handle guerrilla warfare. Rather than a single mob, we had people attacking from all directions. They were completely disorganized. We were just as disorganized." He was awake for days during the riots, working with the National Guard, going block by block, trying to contain the situation until eventually peace was restored. Afterwards, Gates would mostly put the responsibility for the riots on the participants. "Say all you want about social causes. I don't believe they accounted for what occurred. Face it, people gorged themselves with a heady diet of unrestrained conduct, stealing, burning, rock and bottle throwing, destroying and flouting the authority of government." In the years following the riots, Gates saw the relationship between the police and the public become even more strained than it already was. He felt the police were becoming a hated minority. We were pigs. We were universally despised. He was angry that his friend and mentor Parker was taking what he thought was an unfair amount of the blame. And when Parker died, Gates saw himself as the one to take up Parker's legacy and continue his work. Instead of trying to heal the rift and reestablish the connection between the people and the police, Gates continued the us versus them mentality established by Parker. He saw the image of the elite force of the LAPD being tarnished, mocked, and he blamed the public. "We were supposed to intervene respectfully. Hi, I'm Officer Bill," while they swore, spit, hissed, kicked, fought, and threw things at us, which occurred every single day. Many of these were miserable people, pot smokers, college dropouts, wayward and lost human beings, people who had absolutely no interest in anyone's rights but their own. They were bent on pursuing their personal indulgences in pot, LSD, uppers, and downers, and many were bent on causing a revolution. They were out there seeking their own self-interests at any cost, any way they could find. In 1966, while still a lieutenant, Gates moved to answer the calls for revolution and escalating threats of violence by further militarizing the police. He organized the Metro Division into squads and platoons, each headed by a lieutenant. Then he recruited expert marksmen and developed them into their own platoon. These elite officers would form a special unit to deal with snipers or standoffs. They were the Special Weapons Attack Teams, SWAT, although the acronym had to be changed to Special Weapons and Tactics because his deputy felt attack was too violent an image to present to the public. By the time SWAT was first deployed in 1969, Gates had been promoted to Assistant Chief, one step away from Chief of Police. Their first actual mission was in a standoff with the Black Panthers, but the first time the public started to take notice wasn't until 1974, when they clashed with the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA, and their victim/accomplice, Patty Hearst. The SLA were a group of revolutionaries who, in 1974, had kidnapped Patty Hearst, the granddaughter of newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst, from her apartment in Berkeley. A few months earlier, in November, the group had gained national notoriety for gunning down a school superintendent in cold blood. The group kept Hearst imprisoned in a closet for a week, blindfolded and bound. Then they spent weeks threatening and torturing her. In April, Hearst joined the group for a bank robbery, later claiming she had been brainwashed due to the intense psychological trauma she was subjected to. The idea of a young, beautiful heiress being kidnapped into a revolution and working, for all anyone knew at the time, alongside her captors, horrified the public. It played on the fears of class, sexuality, and race that lay at the heart of the American establishment. And in May, the group arrived in Los Angeles.
An explosive gun battle in Los Angeles tonight may have blown the Symbionese Liberation Army apart. You'll see it on dramatic tape and film in a special expanded Eyewitness News.
After being caught shoplifting from a sporting goods store, the group fled with Hearst providing covering fire, 50 rounds in all. Eventually, most of the group was tracked to a small house in south-central Los Angeles. After a brief struggle for jurisdiction, Gates retained control of the scene. Live on television, 225 police officers surrounded the house. SWAT was in charge and decided to try and pressure a surrender. They fired tear gas through one of the windows. The SLA answered back with machine gun fire. Gates described the scene as a war zone, something out of World War II.
As far as I can determine, and you've got as close as I have.
Look out there. That's bad. That's bad.
A fire, possibly started by the tear gas canisters, had begun to burn, and soon the house was consumed. All this time, the LAPD had no idea if Hearst, still a victim in all this despite her possible complicity, was inside the house or not.
The obvious conclusion is that the Los Angeles police have indeed found the nesting place of the Symbionese Liberation Army, and there's not much left of it now.
There's not much left of it now, Bob.
In all, 9,000 rounds of ammunition had been fired, and 6 people burned to death in the house. Hearst, thankfully, was not present. Despite her claims of being brainwashed by her captors, she would be arrested, tried, and sentenced to 35 years in prison, later reduced to 7. Her sentence was commuted by President Carter, and in 2001, she was pardoned by President Clinton on his last day in office. Although Gates claimed to be haunted by the deaths of the 6 people who died in the standoff, he also praised SWAT's response, saying, "They were intrepid. They were brilliant in their deployment. Their execution was flawless." Soon, other law enforcement agencies began mounting their own SWAT teams. The whole nation had watched the shootout, live on network TV. Clearly, SWAT had arrived. In the years that followed, Gates would preside over a litany of other high-profile cases. Marilyn Monroe, Robert Kennedy, the Toolbox Killers, the Hillside Strangler, continuing to build his reputation until, finally, on March 28, 1978, he would become the city's 49th chief of police, a position he would hold for the next 14 years. Despite his crime-fighting innovations and earning the respect and admiration of his officers, Gates' tenure as chief of police is mostly remembered for controversy. His aggressive style of enforcement and adversarial nature of his department led to repeated clashes with civil rights groups and the black community.
Aggressive doesn't mean the use of force. Aggressive means that we move into crime situations and deal with it.
He put the needs and well-being of his officers above all, above the needs of the communities they were meant to be serving.
We have officers out there doing the job, attempting to make good judgment based on the information they have, protecting themselves and protecting the people of the city of Los Angeles that we go to hell for.
He inherited from Parker the idea of officers as blunt instruments, best used to stamp out crime or harass people in the name of prevention. He would never fully understand the roots of the unrest and discontent that was building throughout Los Angeles.
And then when we do something about it, there are those in the community that say our actions are too harsh. Then you talk about black police officers. When a black puts on a police uniform, suddenly he's no longer black. He's treated as the enemy by the black community in many respects.
One of the things I'd like to say, it is not the uniform, it is the behavior. And I don't think we should crowd the issue. It is the behavior that is in question.
And I will tell you, that's not true. And you can talk to black police officers, they will tell you how difficult it is for them to operate.
He was a direct, no-nonsense straight shooter who had tough but easy answers to complex questions. He and his force were on one side, and the cop-hating liberals in the media and on the city council were on the other. Ultimately, his unwavering support of his officers' arrogant and aggressive policing tactics would lock him and the LAPD in a bitter conflict against the black community of Los Angeles. The first major incident of which was that of Eula May Love in 1978. Love had been struggling to make ends meet since the death of her husband 6 months earlier. She was supporting herself and 3 daughters on a Social Security check of $680 a month. She applied to a state program for assistance, but the application hadn't yet been processed. She was 6 months overdue on her gas payment when the meter man showed up to her home in South Central Los Angeles and told her she had to pay $29.09 now or have her gas shut off. Pushed to her limit, Love lost control and hit the meter man on the arm with a shovel when he attempted to turn off the gas. The man fled and reported the incident to his supervisor and the LAPD. Love, meanwhile, walked 5 blocks and bought a money order for the exact amount of the money she owed. Around 4 p.m., 3 vehicles from the gas company showed up to Love's house to turn off the gas. When Love tried to give them the money order, they rolled up their windows and ignored her. She went back into the house and returned with an 11-inch boning knife and was on her lawn swinging it around when the police showed up. The officers, Edward Hobson and Lloyd O'Callahan, told her to drop the knife. Love refused, swore at them, and backed towards her home. They advanced on her, weapons drawn. O'Callahan approached with his baton and knocked the knife from her hand, while Hobson stood about 10 feet away with his gun raised. It was when Love turned to pick up the knife that they opened fire, 6 shots each, including at least 1 while she was on the ground. They hit her 8 times in all. The officers claimed she was about to throw the knife at them. Love's 2 daughters, 15-year-old Sheila and 12-year-old Tammy, witnessed the scene. Following the shooting, O'Callahan and Hobson ejected their spent casings and reloaded their guns. Then, with Sheila and Tammy looking on, Hobson walked over to Eula Love, put his foot on the neck of her still struggling body, pushed down, and according to the girls said, "Lay down, bitch." Then rolling her to the left, he handcuffed her. Edward Hobson and Lloyd O'Callahan had arrived at Eula Love's house at 4:18 in the afternoon. 2 minutes and 27 seconds later, she was dead. The black community was outraged. It was another of their members killed by an indifferent police force. Did the officers really feel threatened by a 5-foot, 175-pound woman with a boning knife, or did they just lose patience and overreact? The killing, however, was deemed in policy by a review board.
It has been determined that the evidence does not warrant the filing of criminal charges. This was a justifiable homicide committed by the officers in their own self-defense.
The people gonna get justice, and it's gonna be in the street.
You know, I've commented on the media squeezing out the last tier of emotion in this situation where they talk about a $22 gas bill. It doesn't make any difference, but it was a $69 gas bill. I guess they don't think I have any sympathy for anyone other than police officers, and that's simply not true. I have great empathy and sympathy for Eula Love and her family. Deeply sorry that it happened, but it did happen.
As far as Gates was concerned, his men had followed procedure, and in his autobiography, he would decry how Eula Love was portrayed in the media. Moral indignation became editorial policy. Jim Bellows, the smart, aggressive editor of the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, the money-losing number 2 paper in town, needed a way to boost sales and must have gone for what he saw as a real opportunity. Then, right in front of her horrified daughters, the police charged up and killed her for failing to pay the gas bill. The case was seen as representational of many of the problems the public had with the LAPD at the time, how the police dealt with the black community, and their attitude toward policing the community in general. It was not the policy of Gates's officers to try to talk people down, to give them a little room and a little understanding. They gave orders which were meant to be obeyed. They were aggressive, arrogant, and backed up by a department that protected its own. The sentiments of the community were backed up by statistics. In the 1970s, 1 in 3 civilians shot by the LAPD were unarmed. From 1975 to 1982, 7 people in Los Angeles were choked to death by the police, compared to 1 chokehold death each in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Dallas. Speaking of chokeholds, Gates came under fire in 1982 for suggesting in an interview with the Los Angeles Times that some blacks, when the chokehold is applied, the vein or arteries do not open up as fast as they do in normal people.
Chief Gates asked me if I could verify the fact, or according to him, the fact that African Americans were very susceptible to chokeholds because they had an anatomical defect in their necks. And so he was suggesting that blacks were not normal in regards to their neck anatomy, and that therefore it was their fault that they were dying, not the fault of the police. And he wanted to know if I would agree with him. And I told him, no, Chief Gates, I don't agree with that. I think that this is something that cannot defend. The real reason is that there were more chokeholds being applied to blacks.
These remarks infuriated the people of Los Angeles, with many calling for his resignation, leading to an outright ban of chokeholds by the LAPD.
Daryl Gates must go. He must not hold this position any longer. For those who would like to continue to say that they want to work with Daryl Gates, I would say to them, no corporation or business in the world would tolerate on-the-job training for this kind of position.
Gates would later call the attacks on him far worse than anything I had experienced, and in some ways, worse even than Rodney King would prove to be. And this wasn't the first time Gates was accused of racism. Shortly after he became chief, he was called out for claiming that Latinos were lazy, although he claimed he was misquoted. Indeed, accusations of racism would follow Gates throughout his career. And there were other controversies for Gates. Shortly after the shooting of Eula Love came the PDID scandal. Not much was known about the Public Disorder Intelligence Division, or PDID. It was not discussed with the public. All anyone really knew was that they were broadly responsible for monitoring and gathering information on what it deemed to be subversive organizations. But in 1971, the Coalition Against Police Abuse went to the ACLU, and together with other organizations and individuals, they filed a lawsuit. Over 6,000 pages of material were ordered released to the public, and they showed that the LAPD had been spying on over 200 organizations and individuals, liberal groups, civil rights groups, environmental groups, women's groups, city councilmen, and, in at least one case, a member of Congress.
When we were told at one time that there were no undercover agents in this chamber, the day that the Sun Desert nuclear plant hearing was taking place, and in fact there was an undercover agent of PDID in the chamber at that time.
In 1984, the case was settled out of court for $640,000. According to Gates, the ACLU was forced to settle because they were going broke. And upon hearing this, he chuckled. Actually, I laughed. I laughed out loud. Despite the controversies in his aggressive tactics, or because of them, Gates remained fairly popular among Los Angeles residents. He and his department had proven itself time and again to be impervious to scandal and resistant to any form of outrage or protest. Violent crime was a major concern, the public was afraid, and they saw Gates as a plain-spoken, no-nonsense authoritarian who could get the job done. After the success of the police department's handling of Los Angeles' 1984 Olympic Games, Gates saw even more support. Sure, he was a little rough around the edges and had a habit of putting his foot in his mouth, but at the end of the day, he was the kind of guy you wanted leading your team in a crisis. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to be restrained by the bleeding hearts crying about fair play and the rules. And this was a crisis. Los Angeles, after all, was on the front line of a new war, the war on drugs.
Today, there's a new epidemic, smokable cocaine, otherwise known as crack. It is an explosively destructive and often lethal substance which is crushing its users. It is an uncontrolled fire.
During the 1980s, in response to the increased attention and media coverage around the spread of crack cocaine, President Reagan greatly expanded the reach of the drug war first declared by Nixon in 1971.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed by Congress, allocating $1.7 billion to the war on drugs and establishing mandatory minimums for drug offenses. These minimums were seen by many as designed to target the black community. For example, 5 years was the minimum sentence for possession of 5 grams of crack, which was more popular in black neighborhoods, while it would take 500 grams of powder cocaine, more popular among the white community, to get that same sentence. These new laws led to a massive increase in incarcerations for nonviolent drug offenses, from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997. Gates went about dealing with these problems in his customary style, saying to U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in 1990 that casual drug users ought to be taken out and shot. It was the good people of America against the epidemic of crack cocaine, a war of Bloods versus Crips and the law-abiding caught in the middle. This wasn't a time to question a man whose troops protected you from being overwhelmed by gang crime. They were Parker's thin blue line. And maybe they went too far sometimes, but look what they had to deal with on the streets, trying to save communities while there were still communities to be saved. If anything, they needed more support, not less. They were in a war, and in a war, you need weapons, and they got them. Battering rams in 1985. Repurposed V-100 armored cars, left over from the Olympic Games where they were used in case of a terrorist attack, now used for raids on crack houses. The department attached a steel battering ram, painted them blue, and labeled them rescue vehicles, because according to Gates, the communities were being rescued. Although not the first time military surplus was used in policing, the repurposed V-100s would become an iconic image of the spread of police militarization in America. There were protests from the black community about the use of the battering ram, but this was a time of drive-by shootings, of images of the aftermath of gang violence taking over the nightly news. People were afraid, and many, even in black communities that were historically anti-police, welcomed the increased presence. The increased traction gained by Gates's crash program was also seen as necessary.
One of LAPD's special gang units, Crash, is heading off to patrol one of the city's most dangerous gangs, the Culver City Boys.
There were protests against the Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums program, or CRASH, when it was first introduced in 1979. Opponents claimed it unfairly targeted Black and Latino communities, but now, many felt that if it took militarization to protect people, then that's what it took. As an editorial in the Los Angeles Sentinel put it in 1984, there was a time when Black people said there were too many police officers in this community. But the simple facts of the matter are that only the criminals who wish for their crimes to go undetected are saying that there are too many police officers in South Central Los Angeles. Throughout the 1980s, Gates sought to expand the scope of his anti-gang programs both on and off the streets. Yet another Gates acronym, DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education, was started in 1983. The program sent police into classrooms to educate children on the dangers of drugs. Although popular throughout the 80s and still around today, its effectiveness at keeping children off drugs is questionable at best. Meanwhile, the LAPD was arresting an unprecedented number of people, mostly on charges of sale or possession. In 1980, the California prison population was around 25,000. By 1990, it was around 95,000. 14,500 of those inmates would be paroled each year, and 60% of those parolees would return to jail within 2 years. Crime rates continued to rise. Gates, for all his battering rams, acronyms, and aggressive policing, was not stemming the tide of violence. But to him, this wasn't a failure of policing, it was a failure of society. It's not that the system was ineffective necessarily. Picking up drug-addicted young men for minor crimes, then releasing them back on the streets without any form of rehabilitation or counseling, but now with a criminal record, all but unemployable and returning to neighborhoods that were economically destitute, this wasn't the problem. The problem, according to Gates, was not his methods. It was the convergence of the drugs and the gangs and the media. Fueled by drug activity, the growth of the gangs was aided too by the enormous media coverage given them. Hoodlums saw themselves on the evening news and came away with the self-importance they had been searching for all their lives. If you're in a gang and you don't have a weekly killing or a drive-by shooting, you're nothing. You don't get no news at 11. You ain't gonna be a star. Media coverage of gangs begat more acts of violence, increasing the tension in the community. That tension created a demand for the police to move in. But despite the war on drugs and the images on the news and the rising statistics, for many of the people living outside of the communities where it was happening, all these terrible and frightening problems were pretty much contained. To many city leaders and white locals, it was gangs killing gangs. The situation was bad and getting worse, but it was mostly confined to LA's South Side. It was a problem, but it wasn't everyone's problem. It was locked away behind racial and economic barriers. That's how it seemed, at least, until Karen Tashima was killed. On the night of January 30th, 1988, while she was strolling through Westwood Village, Karen Tashima was caught in the crossfire between two rival gangs and shot in the head. She was the 96th homicide victim so far that year, just another innocent who caught a stray. But this happened in Westwood Village, an affluent and predominantly white neighborhood, next to UCLA and just a few minutes' drive from Brentwood, Bel Air, and Beverly Hills. Westwood Village was made up of shops, restaurants, and theaters. If a neighborhood like Westwood wasn't safe, what was next? The story exploded. The gang warfare that everyone had been hearing about for years was now spreading beyond the poorer neighborhoods and approaching the rich white havens. The city scrambled to allocate funds to raise the police presence. Patrols were tripled in the neighborhood, and 150 new officers were approved to be hired. The city was scared, and they wanted action.
There are signs tonight that we may be headed toward another bloody summer in Los Angeles. Our top story tonight, even as police clamp down on street gangs, the wave of violence that has terrorized residents of South Central LA continues unabated.
There was more street gang violence in Los Angeles overnight. At least 5 people were killed and 6 others wounded. Gang violence and the fear of gang violence is spreading in Southern California.
The new gangs, the crack-fed gangs that are booming in America's cities.
Just as Los Angeles police thought they were gaining ground in the war against gangs, the street violence claimed another life.
No one cared anymore about the racial remarks, the illegal spying, the chokeholds or shootings. They looked to Police Chief Daryl Gates for help, and he knew just what to do, what he had been attempting to do for years. Amplify the pressure, expand the scope. And with the support of the people, the city, and the country, he announced Operation Hammer.
These are no good, miserable sons of bitches that are plaguing the city, and we got to get rid of them.
Operation Hammer was a massive series of indiscriminate gang sweeps, rounding up young black men by the thousands. People wanted to see results. They wanted numbers, and they got them. In all, as many as 50,000 arrests were made by the time the operation ended in 1990. They arrested as many people as possible for as many reasons as they could find. Suspicion of gang activity gave them a fairly broad definition to work with. Young men wearing red or blue bandanas, flashing what appeared to be gang signs, or generally looking suspicious, or finding an excuse to impound a car. After all, you couldn't do a drive-by if you didn't have a vehicle. Never mind if the charges would stick, this was about sending a message. The Gates method of proactive policing had reached its final form.
And we will do everything in our power to put the gang members where they belong, and that's in jail, off the street.
Officers were never given clear instructions on how exactly to manage these sweeps or deal with the suspected gang members, and much of the policing amounted to harassment. This did little to deter young men from joining gangs or building respect for the police. People don't like being bullied and humiliated, and given the history of the black community and the LAPD, this was a particularly dangerous approach to policing.
Black gangs in Los Angeles, black gangs are organized and they are distributing coke in the city, rock cocaine.
Throughout much of South Central Los Angeles, a deep rage against the LAPD was climbing to levels not seen since the Watts riots. Despite having more or less free rein to operate as he pleased and crime figures dropping in 1987, Gates had failed to solve the problem of gang violence. But again, the problem wasn't his approach, it was a lack of support. What was wrong with the crime-solving equation we found wasn't the police. It was the money to fund the police and the laxity of the criminal justice system after the police had done their job. With jails and prisons overcrowded, there was not enough room to hold and control those who needed to be taken off the streets and kept for as long as possible. The murderer of Karen Tashima was eventually apprehended. Darrell DeWitt was sentenced to 27 years to life for the killing. He was paroled in 2022. Incidentally, it's worth noting that Gates does not mention Karen Tashima at all in his memoir. According to his account, Operation Hammer was initiated as a response to a general rise in gang violence, and plans for the operation may have been in place before Karen Tashima's murder. But her death was a significant turning point, and its absence seems telling. Perhaps having the police appear to take the death of one individual more seriously than the deaths of others hurt his narrative of an organization that worked for the betterment of all. In any case, it was the murder of Karen Tashima that brought the problem of Los Angeles gang violence to national and international attention. And that same year, 1988, the film Colors, directed by Dennis Hopper, and NWA's album Straight Outta Compton, would make LA gangs a part of the popular culture. Colors starred Sean Penn and Robert Duvall as 2 crash officers on the streets of LA, lost in a hopeless battle against a problem whose size and scope was beyond their ability to handle.
That's right. You get them off the street.
Lady, we're trying.
You need more help.
The film was divisive. Some saw it as a hard look at a gray area. Others thought it glorified gang violence. Some saw it as too hard on the police, others too sympathetic.
I got a little plan. Maybe we can work something out. You ever heard of Earl Scheib, Holmes? Look at that shit.
In Straight Outta Compton, on the other hand, NWA left no doubt as to the message or whose side they were on. Track 2 of the album pretty much summed up their feelings about the LAPD. They told the story from the other side, from the point of view of those who had suffered from the abuses of power at the hands of the police. They became a voice for the angry black community at a time when the narrative was predominantly white. Their music was aggressive, controversial, and hugely popular, the album eventually going triple platinum. The accompanying video for the song Straight Outta Compton depicted a gang sweep on an LA neighborhood and was filmed not long after the infamous raid on Dalton Avenue. During the Dalton Avenue raid, 80 officers tore through 4 apartments in 2 small buildings. Residents were handcuffed and thrown to the floor while their homes were demolished by the LAPD. Furniture and walls were smashed with sledgehammers, as were appliances. Sofas and chairs were slashed with knives. Even toilets were destroyed. The police even spray-painted LAPD rules on a nearby wall before leaving. And all this for a small amount of marijuana and less than an ounce of cocaine. Gates, unsurprisingly, defended the actions of his officers. While he acknowledged that the situation got out of hand, he did say that the officers were trying very hard to do the right thing, to solve the narcotics trafficking problem. Unfortunately, while doing the right thing, they were doing it the wrong way. Although 3 officers involved in the raid were charged by the DA, they were all acquitted. However, the video for Straight Outta Compton, described by one critic as incendiary, was eventually banned by MTV.
There is a recklessness in today's gang wars that make even the prohibition battles of the 1920s pale by comparison.
By 1991, the struggles of the LAPD against the crack epidemic and gang violence were now a part of the popular consciousness, and Daryl Gates was known to be a controversial figure, as hated as he was supported.
The hardcore gang member, he's a sociopath. He's an individual that you can't do anything with. He has no conscience.
Both Gates and his department were repeatedly called out for pushing boundaries and breaking the rules. From 1986 to 1991, the city of Los Angeles paid out $23 million in damages for civil rights violations. After a man had his nose broken by the police during a search of his home, Gates said during the trial he's lucky that's all he had broken, resulting in a $170,000 judgment against Gates personally. That settlement, too, was paid for by the city. But Gates, as always, was seemingly untouched by the outrages and controversies. He was still doing his job, holding the line, protecting people from an onslaught of chaos that constantly threatened to explode their lives. Charges of overt police aggression were still commonplace. Violent crime rates, after briefly dipping in 1987, rose steadily afterwards. Gates would still catch heat from time to time for his methods or for his comments in the press, but none of it seemed to stick. His department had a 74% approval rating, according to a poll in the LA Times. And through it all, the racial remarks and battering rams, the killing of Eula Love, Dalton Avenue and the gang sweeps, Gates was a constant. A celebrated leader who had proudly served his city for 42 years. And anyway, even if they wanted to get rid of him, they couldn't. According to the city charter, the mayor lacked that power. Chief Daryl Gates was secure in his position and would hold it for as long as he saw fit. Or so it seemed. Saturday, March 3rd, 1991, 25-year-old Rodney Glenn King was driving down the Foothill Freeway after drinking in a park with some friends. He was speeding, driving recklessly, when he was spotted by a California Highway Patrol car. The officers claimed King's speed was between 100 and 117 miles per hour, although whether he could get his 1998 Hyundai up to anywhere close to that seems suspect. The cruiser pulled up behind him and flashed its lights. King was on parole for a second-degree robbery conviction, but he wasn't from South Central. He was from a middle-class suburb of Pasadena. He wasn't a Blood or Crip, and the year he had spent in lockup had scared him enough that he did not want to go back. So when he saw the lights flashing in his rear view, he panicked. He sped up. The police pursued. He exited the freeway and blew through a stop sign at 50 miles an hour as two LAPD squad cars joined the pursuit. Eventually, some 8 miles or so later, King pulled over. King and his friends were ordered out of the car. King stepped out of one side, his friends the other. King was faced with a circle of 27 officers, some with their guns trained on him. An LAPD helicopter circled above. Witnesses watched the scene unfold from a nearby apartment building. According to most witnesses, King was calm and compliant, although clearly intoxicated. Some say he was dancing around, amused at the excessive amount of police and taunting them by grabbing his rear. But he did lay on the ground as ordered. While he was on the ground, Officer Lawrence Powell, who had previous complaints against him for excessive use of force, police brutality, and misconduct, approached to handcuff him. Powell grabbed King's wrists and twisted them up behind his back. King screamed and twisted in pain. Someone yelled, "Back!" and the other officers moved away. Officer Stacy Kuhn, who also had past brutality charges, stepped forward and shot King in the chest with a taser. That was when Powell landed the first blow, swinging his baton 2 feet long in solid aluminum like a baseball bat across King's face, then continuing to pound his head. Powell would later argue that King was on his feet, but eyewitnesses would say that he was attacked while prone. Either way, after the first hits to the face, King stumbled up and tried to run away. One witness would say he ran blindly, but not running at anybody, just trying to get away. Lawrence Powell hit King again, soon joined by Stacy Kuhn and Officer Timothy Wind. The three men mercilessly beat King, 56 blows in 81 seconds. A fourth officer, Theodore Braceno, stepped forward and stomped on King's neck. He too had previous complaints against him and had previously been suspended without pay for kicking a handcuffed prisoner. The officers claimed that King repeatedly tried to get up, that they were concerned for their safety and were trying to get him to stay down. Others argue that King was down and the movements were his body reacting to the blows against it. But as the beating took place, the other officers simply looked on. King would suffer a broken cheekbone, cracks around his eye socket, multiple fractures along the base of his skull, a concussion, facial nerve damage, a broken right ankle, and multiple bruises and lacerations. The police beat him so hard, they knocked the fillings out of his teeth. Pacifica Hospital nurses reported that the officers who accompanied King openly joked and bragged about the number of times they had hit him. Complaints against the LAPD were nothing new. From 1986 to 1990, there were 8,274 allegations of misconduct. Complaints from the Black community against the police for use of excessive force were nothing new. These complaints were noted, sometimes litigated, and then the LAPD moved on, unchanged. Complaints and payouts in civil suits were seen as the cost of doing business. The police were fighting a war against impossible odds, And if some people got hurt along the way, that's regrettable, but we have to look at the larger picture. As Gates said, you have to ask why the officer did this. We have to say, he made a mistake, but I can understand. What made the Rodney King incident different was not the brutality of the attack, but the fact that it was filmed. George Holliday shot the video on his new Sony Video 8 Handycam from the balcony of his apartment across the street. It was 9 minutes of footage that would shock and outrage the world. That weekend, as King was beaten and arrested, Daryl Gates was in Washington attending a summit on crime. On Tuesday, President George H.W. Bush said to a room full of law enforcement officials that if they wanted to look at a real American hero, they should look at Los Angeles Chief of Police Daryl Gates. But by then, Gates was already back in LA, viewing the tape for the first time. According to his autobiography, when Gates first viewed the videos, he felt terribly shocked and sick to his stomach, sick at heart. But in an interview he did with Playboy magazine not long after the incident, he said, "I'm more horrified by some of the reaction I see this week. I'm horrified by the indictment of the good work of more than 8,000 police officers, day in, day out, trudging along, doing a wonderful job. And we are showing a great deal of sympathy for this guy, and, maybe we ought to. He certainly didn't deserve what occurred. But on the other hand, I don't think he deserves this picture of a model citizen that is being painted. Cute little kids, and I'm going to get a job, and all I want to do is set my life straight." The video first played on KTLA News the Monday after the beating before being picked up by CNN, then The World. Within 2 weeks, 9 in 10 Americans would say they had seen or heard of the beating of Rodney King, and the response was swift and furious. Almost immediately, there were calls for Gates to resign. Calls from the police, the media, the California State Assembly, and the U.S. Judiciary Committee Chairman, Joseph Biden. The FBI was called in to investigate. The Los Angeles Times ran a poll on their front page claiming that 2/3 of respondents believed that police brutality was common. After years of seeming to be untouchable, it looked like everyone was coming for Gates. To add fuel to the public fury, just 13 days after the release of the Rodney King tape, a 15-year-old girl, Latasha Harlins, was shot and killed by a Korean store owner, Soon-Ja Do. Do suspected Harlins of trying to steal a bottle of orange juice. Harlins died with the money for the juice, $1.79, in her hand. The case went to trial in November of 1991. Dew was found guilty, but Judge Joyce Carlin suspended the sentence and gave Dew 5 years probation. Just 5 days later, a man was sentenced to 30 days in jail for beating a dog. The symbolism was clear. The community was outraged, and the pressure was mounting on the department and the city for quick and decisive action, for justice. 2 weeks after the beating, on March 15th, the 4 officers were charged, booked, and out on bail. The mayor, Tom Bradley, who had a history of locking horns with Gates, promised to bring justice to those who committed the illegal acts, and appointed a commission headed by former Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher to investigate the LAPD and recommend reforms. He also formally asked for Gates's resignation. Gates refused. The mayor had to do something. He couldn't fire Gates because of his civil service protection. And besides, a poll by the Los Angeles Times found that only 31% of city residents wanted Gates out. Bradley turned to the police commission, which oversaw the department, and on April 4th, they suspended Gates for 60 days. But the next day, the city council ordered him reinstated. Despite everything, Gates had the support and the power. In July, the Christopher Commission published its report detailing institutionalized tolerance for the use of excessive force and racially motivated abuse by the police department.
Coming up on Eyewitness News at 5, the Christopher Commission releases its long-awaited report on the LAPD and makes some shocking recommendations.
Panel calls on Chief Gates to step down, and the chief will talk about whether he stays or goes.
Christopher Commission report that says the LAPD is marred by brutality, racism, and a breakdown in leadership.
Transcripts made public in the report revealed just how deep the casual racism went. One message read, "Sounds like monkey slapping time." Another, "Batten down the hatches, several thousand Zulus approaching from the north." It was also revealed at this time that for crimes involving all black victims and perpetrators, officers would use the shorthand NHI, no human involved. The report concluded by recommending that the city reassert control of the police department, that it limit the term for the chief of police and make the chief more accountable to elected officials. It also suggested that Gates and the police commissioners step down.
Chief Gates made it plain he will ignore the Christopher Commission's recommendation that he begin to ease himself out of office. We say that if I would stay while my successor is being picked, but of course you don't want to pick a successor until the changes have been made.
According to Gates, the Christopher Commission report hit the department like a Scud missile. And although he thought much of the report was unsubstantiated and misrepresented, some of the details were too damning to deny, coming as they did from 2 of his assistant chiefs, David Dotson and Jesse Brewer. Dotson and Brewer testified to a culture of overt aggression and lack of discipline, where Gates was encouraging officers to believe that there were different classes of people that can be treated in different ways. At one point, Dotson testified that the department had failed miserably to hold supervisors accountable for excessive force by officers under their command. From the beginning, Gates had stood firm in the face of repeated calls for his resignation. "How could I resign after this?" he had asked a reporter. He had told his department that he wasn't going to resign. He was going to stay and make sure that what he says gets done until the image of the department is restored and we can hold our heads high again. But now, faced with damning testimony coming from those closest to him, he had nowhere to go and no one to blame. He announced that he would retire in 1 year, in April 1992. Then he changed it to June. The Christopher Commission changes would be put on the ballot in June, and Gates decided he would only resign if the changes passed. The fact that his autobiography would also be published in June was probably not coincidental. As Gates was dealing with the fallout of the Christopher Commission, the case against the 4 officers proceeded. They were all indicted for assault with a deadly weapon, but Stacy Kuhn and Lawrence Powell were also indicted with filing a false report. They were looking at over 7 years in prison. Timothy Wind, also 7 years, and Theodore Berseno, for his kick to King's neck, was facing 5 years. Claiming the defendants could not get a fair and impartial trial, the defense requested it be moved out of Los Angeles County, and, shockingly, the court agreed. After all, it wasn't that the residents of Los Angeles County had seen the tape. By then, everyone had seen the tape. The case was moved to Simi Valley, a county that was 70% white and only 2% black, and together with neighboring city Thousand Oaks, was home to over 4,000 law enforcement officers, including members of the LAPD. This area would sometimes be referred to as Copland. The jury for the trial would contain 10 white people, 1 Hispanic woman, 1 Filipino woman, and no black people. The prosecution's strategy was to let the tape speak for itself. They felt that was all they needed. They called emergency room doctors who described the injuries and nurses who heard the officers bragging about the beating.
And did Mr. Powell say something else?
Yeah, he says, don't you remember that hardball game? We hit quite a few home runs.
A dispatcher testified as to what the officers said over the radio.
And what was that message?
The message states, I haven't beaten anyone this bad in a long time.
They also called other officers who condemned the brutality of the attack.
And he struck the driver right across the top of the cheekbone, splitting his face from the top of his ear to his chin.
Prior to Officer Powell hitting him with the baton, did anyone give the driver any type of commands after this second taser shot that you described?
No, sir.
Was there any reason, or was there any reason for the strike to the head by Officer Powell at the time he struck him?
In my opinion, no, sir. There was no reason for it.
Of the over 30 eyewitnesses to the attack, they only called one, George Holliday, the man who recorded the tape. They chose not to call King himself, fearing how he would be characterized and manipulated by the defense. They didn't want King or King's character to be the focus of the trial. And of course, that is just what the defense wanted. Their first strategy was to blame King for the attack. Why was he speeding? Why didn't he pull over? Why wouldn't he just stay down?
You will see through still photographs and through the videotape, when you see it, as the district attorney said many times, that Rodney King, without warning, with no one touching him, rose to his feet and turned within 2 seconds to the frame in a violent charge to Powell.
Then they wanted to demonize him. Didn't he have a criminal record? Hadn't he been in jail before? He was a convicted armed robber, after all. Meanwhile, the officers would be portrayed as good men who faced impossible odds. They put their lives on the line day in and day out to protect the public, to protect you, the jury. As far as the tape went, it didn't tell the full story. There were things you couldn't see on the tape. King was a wild man. The officers had their safety to worry about.
You see the officers giving a torrent of blows to his body.
Yes, to his arms, to his torso, to his legs.
All right, have you given any specific direction to Mr. King at this time?
I've been yelling at him to get down, to stay down at this time.
All right, and has he gotten down, sir?
No, sir, he continues to rise.
And what are you thinking now, sir?
I'm getting concerned, scared. I'm getting a little frightened here now because this gentleman has just been subjected to a multitude of blows with the metal PR-24, and there is no evidence that he's going to go into compliance mode.
Mr. King took his arms and broke them free of my grasp and the other officer's grasp, put him down on the ground in a push-up position, raised up his torso, and knocked me off, and I fell backwards and landed on my rear.
When this happened, did that concern you?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I had all my body weight on top of this guy, and in a matter of seconds, he had done a push-up and had knocked me off and wasn't complying with the handcuffing. He was resisting. His fighting.
Yes, they used force, but police work is sometimes brutal. And the reality is that they used a controlled application of force to control an aggressive, combative suspect.
All right, sir. And in this particular set of circumstances, is a baton an appropriate weapon to use to stop that advance or escape?
Yes, it is.
In the end, the jury agreed. On April 29th, 1992, after 7 days of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Not guilty. Not guilty on all counts, except one against Lawrence Powell, which hung the jury and for which the judge declared a mistrial. The jury had actually decided on acquittal on the first day and had spent the next 6 days deliberating the one assault count against Powell. While Parker Center and the police around Los Angeles celebrated, Mayor Bradley held a press conference saying he was stunned, shocked, and outraged. The acquittals were announced at 3 p.m. A few hours later, the unrest began.
Let's go back to the song, bud. Let's see how you feel this morning. I've been listening to KJLA talk about life. I only have 3 words for that thing. I hope the same 3 words that was uttered in the 1965 riot. You're going to say those bad words, huh? Heard, baby, bro.
People around the country, the world, witnessed the riots live on television. The fires, the looting, the destruction, pundits and politicians expressing shock and outrage. But the most enduring image of the riots was the assault on Reginald Denny, a truck driver who had the misfortune to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Denny was pulled from his truck and violently assaulted by a group of rioters. The attack ended when one rioter bashed Denny's skull with a cinder block, fracturing it in 91 places and causing severe brain damage. It would take years of rehabilitation, but even so, his speech and his ability to walk were permanently damaged. It wasn't just the viciousness of the attack. It wasn't that it was unprovoked. It was the celebrations that shocked people. Through Denny's assault and all through similar scenes that were playing out around the city, people were left with one question: where were the police? Around the city, people complained of police driving past scenes of looting and theft. Terry Barnett, a woman who, along with her boyfriend and 2 others, helped rescue Denny and drive him to the hospital, all people of color, incidentally, said there were 4 cops in each car that passed by. They saw us. They looked right through us. Gates was not prepared for the riots. No plans were in place, and he was incredibly slow to react. The night the riots began, he was at a fundraiser in West Los Angeles, apparently after having told his officers to retreat. Police did not respond to incidents of looting and violence until 3 hours after the initial start of the rioting. Gates at first said that he was unprepared because no one knew when the verdict would come out. Except the court announced that morning that the verdict would be read at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He then claimed the lack of police help was because his officers were busy protecting firefighters. Except the assaults, like those on Denny, had taken place before the fires had broken out. Just before 9 p.m. that evening, Mayor Bradley called for a state of emergency, and the governor ordered 2,000 National Guard troops to be deployed. On May 1st, King himself appeared on television, imploring people to stop the violence.
People, I just want to say, you know, can we all get along? Can we get along? Can we stop making it horrible for the older people and the kids? And thing is, it's just not right. It's not right, and it's not gonna change anything. We've got to quit. We've got to quit. You know, after all, I mean, I can understand the first upset for the first 2 hours after the verdict, but to keep going on like this, and to see the security guard shot on the ground, it's just not right. It's just not right.
In all, some 6,000 guardsmen were deployed, along with 3,000 to 4,000 Army troops and Marines and 1,000 riot-trained federal officers. A curfew was imposed, schools were shut down, Los Angeles was declared a federal disaster area. The riots lasted 6 days in all. When it was all over, more than 50 people were killed, including 10 shot by LAPD officers and National Guardsmen. Over 2,000 were injured and nearly 6,000 arrested for looting and arson. Property damage totaled over $1 billion, making the riots the most destructive in American history. A week later, Gates addressed an auditorium filled with reporters and high-ranking officials and said that his department had responded beautifully to the riots, that the only major problem was their slow reaction to the start of the disturbance, for which he blamed a lieutenant.
If you had a plan, it didn't make any sense. The head of the police commission, Stanley Scheinbaum, said, placing blame is not the issue. What is the issue is, where was the plan? And the lieutenant, the field commander, whom you accused of failing to contain the riot at the flashpoint, also says there was no plan, no preparations, no mechanism to hold the day watch over, no radios, no batteries, and no ammunition except for what was in the officer's shotguns. If there was a plan, why didn't people know about it?
Well, first of all, Katie, they did. The sheriff's quote is a misquote. I've already talked to him. He's very upset over that quote.
And there are many others, though.
Yeah, and the Stanley Scheinbaum is too new to know whether it was a plan. The lieutenant, quite frankly, has made some serious mistakes.
He said his department was aware of the unrest the verdict could cause and had been preparing for months. The execution, except at that one location, went just as we planned it, he said, referring to the intersection where the riots first began, where Denny was pulled from his car. He said pulling officers out of that intersection and not sending them back in was, quote, the biggest glitch I've seen. The public did not agree. A new poll by the Los Angeles Times showed that 81% disapproved of the job he was doing. And on April 28th, after 43 years on the force, 14 of them as chief, Daryl Gates was forced to retire. Gates' autobiography came out before he was forced into retirement, before the riots, before the King verdict. Gates wrote, 11 months after Rodney King, harmony in the city had finally been restored, at least for the moment. Gates closes out his autobiography with the following. Soon I would walk out of Parker Center as a sworn officer of the Los Angeles Police Department for the very last time. I had stayed as long as I cared to. No one had run me out.
Check it out, Izzy with none other than my main man, Daryl Gates. Him was the chief of Los Angeles Police.
After his retirement, Gates kept a relatively low profile. He hosted a short-lived radio show. He worked on a video game, Sierra's Police Quest Open Season, although his amount of design involvement is questionable.
Carrie, get that son of a bitch.
He also consulted on Sierra's SWAT series of games. He founded Global E-Point, a private investigation and security company, and frequently appeared as a panel guest and pundit on news shows. On April 26, 2010, Gates died of cancer at his home in California. He was 83 years old. He had spent over half his life working with the LAPD. Willie Williams was Gates' successor to the title of Police Chief of Los Angeles and became the first black chief in the city's history. He tried to institute reforms but found it difficult to make any progress. Williams was an outsider from the East Coast and faced deep distrust from a department that often worked to undermine him.
The LAPD deals with another scandal. Jeffrey Kay of KCET Los Angeles reports.
The anti-gang unit known as CRASH, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, had a reputation as hard-charging and aggressive. But to civil rights lawyers, CRASH officers acted like another gang. An unknown number of LA officers lied, planted evidence, and framed suspects. So far, 32 cases have been thrown out. 11 officers have been relieved of duty. More are under investigation.
It wasn't until the Rampart scandal of the late 90s, when over 70 officers were implicated in misconduct, ranging from police brutality in planting evidence to drug dealing and bank robbery, that the city began to take police reform seriously. And even then, the reforms were not done because of a moral imperative, but as a matter of compliance after the Justice Department stepped in and forced the city to reform. Because the city would not finance the reforms at the time, many of the recommendations in the Christopher Commission report were never implemented. After the Rampart scandal, the Justice Department required the city to show compliance with each change recommended by the report. All in all, it would take 12 years and hundreds of millions of dollars. The department made changes related to diversity in recruiting and promoting, and pushed the need to treat the public with respect. There would be no more military-style raids on crack houses. Supervisors were held more directly accountable for the actions of their officers, and gang prevention units were now required to work more closely with the community. Use of force policies were also amended, with officers encouraged to de-escalate, reduce tensions, and limit how and when deadly force is justified. The changes were designed to help the LAPD work with the community, not against it. But reform is never an easy process, and just as the '92 riots echoed the Watts Rebellion, another incident outside of Los Angeles would mirror Rodney King.
I can't breathe over there. I can't breathe! I can't breathe! Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter! Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name!
What happened to George Floyd did not occur in Los Angeles, but the incident, the attitudes, the language, the justification all looked very familiar. They were part of a playbook written decades earlier in Los Angeles.
We are fighting an institutional, systemic problem that has been allowed to permeate since we were brought to these shores.
The model of policing deployed by Gates, racial profiling, excessive force, militarization, was now being confronted in cities all across America. Meanwhile, the rift between the police and the public continues to broaden, and it seems the sides are more disparate than ever. One group declares Blue Lives Matter, waving American flags with Parker's thin blue line across the center, while the other proclaims all cops are bastards and believes the system is beyond reform. And over this conflict, the shadow of Gates still hangs. Today, Daryl Gates is seen as an emblem of the bad old days, of a militaristic police force who viewed the public as a threat. He has become seen, as one columnist wrote, as the last emperor of the LAPD. The fear of the tough cop mentality of the Gates era still remains in the public consciousness. Public trust in the police remains low. New leaders are viewed with skepticism, and the LAPD faces continued recruitment problems. And yet many of Gates's policies of expansion seem to have been embraced. Military equipment now flows freely to police departments. National Guard deployment has become normalized. The line between police, military, and immigration forces has become blurred beyond recognition. Towards the end of his autobiography, Gates laid out his plan for how the system could be improved. He began his list with, "Identify the enemy," and in this phrase lies the central failure of his philosophy. Gates understood policing as war, a conflict between good people and bad people. And once that division is accepted, nearly any action can be justified in the name of order. Under Gates, the LAPD was a blunt force. As the problems of drugs and gang violence grew, its only response was to grow in turn, adopt new tactics and weapons, demand fewer restrictions, strike first and hit hard. The answer to the rise in crime was always expansion and never reflection. Watts was dismissed as an anomaly, King as a misunderstanding. Warnings weren't heeded, lessons weren't learned. Blame was put on the people, not the policies. And so the cycle continued. The city burned in 1992, just as it had in 1965. It seems logical to fight crime harshly, to fight fear with force, to face violence with overwhelming power, to draw clear lines between good people and bad people. But the history of the LAPD teaches us otherwise. It teaches us that the trust of a community is fragile, that it can be destroyed by one bad initiative or incident or person, by one bad act carried out in the name of order. And once lost, it can take generations to rebuild, if it can ever be rebuilt at all. It has been more than 30 years since the city burned, since Rodney King asked, "Can we all get along?" But he wasn't just asking for peace. He was asking whether power could exist without humiliation, whether authority could exist without violence, whether order could exist without enemies. And so long as policing is understood as war, the answer remains the same. Not yet.